Hi there, I'm Ian Fairholm and I'm a senior lecturer in psychology at the University of Bath. My main research area and interests are in the history of psychology, which is relevant because this lecture series is about the history of psychology as a science. I'm going to be talking to you over a series of lectures about how psychology is developed, and today we're going to mainly be focusing in this particular segment on the sort of philosophical and historical basis for psychology as a science. So although psychology was officially founded as a science by Wilhelm Wundt in 1879 as the science of mind and consciousness, there's obviously quite a lot of prehistory to that. So one of the key things to say about the history of psychology is that it wasn't that Wilhelm Wundt one day in 1879 got out of bed and thought, I'm going to make psychology a science. In fact, psychology does not exist within a vacuum. So although we know that the word psychology was used before Wilhelm Wundt created psychology as a science, it's difficult to pinpoint exactly when it was used for the first time. But we do know, for example, that in 1749, the doctor and philosopher David Hartley used the word psychology to describe the theory of the human mind. But even then, most people were not using the word psychology in that way. In fact, it wasn't really until the 1800s that people started to talk about psychology as being a study or a theory of the human mind. In fact, it's also worth saying that, of course, even though psychology didn't really begin until 1879, that didn't mean that people weren't talking about or weren't interested in topics of psychology before then. So, for example, that we know by looking at historical records that there's evidence of people discussing psychological topics and psychological issues and debating psychological issues going back to ancient times. So, for example, in ancient Greece and ancient Egypt, and also in China and India and Persia, we have records of people discussing psychological topics. They were talking about things like free will and whether or not we have free will, whether or not we are who we are because of our choices or because of maybe our parents' influence or environments or genetics and so on and so forth. And also people in these cultures were talking about things like personality and intelligence and mental illness and leadership and relationships and love and so on and so forth, all the kind of psychological topics that we discuss now within the subject. So it's not to say that because psychology didn't really start as a science until the 19th century that psychology topics weren't around. And in fact, we know that psychology topics have been discussed by various people for many centuries. One of the topics that's particularly relevant to talk about now is a topic called the mind-body problem. Now, the mind-body problem is a kind of long-running debate about whether or not the mind and the body are the same thing or whether they are separate and distinct. So, for example, some people argue that the mind is a separate and distinct entity, that it is something that exists outside of the body, and therefore it's possible for a mind to exist before a human being is born, and also it's possible for that mind to exist after a person dies. Other people argue that the body and the mind are the same thing, that they are not distinct. Therefore, the mind is simply a product of the body. Now, throughout history, lots of different people have proposed different ideas about the role of the mind and body and also how they interact and relate to each other. One of the people we're going to talk about next is a French philosopher and scientist by the name of René Descartes. Now, René Descartes was interested in the mind and the body, and he was interested in studying those two things. And one of the things he noted about human beings is that although human beings were obviously conscious, they showed intention and will, and they could cause things to happen, that some of the things that human beings did appeared to be reflexive or reflexes. So, for example, the knee-jerk response, you may be aware that if someone were to tap your knee, that your knee would involuntarily flex, there'd be a reflex. And Descartes noticed that there were whole ranges of behaviours that human beings did that were not conscious, they were not driven by will or an intention, but in fact they happened automatically. Now, another thing that Descartes noticed was that Animals, on the other hand, didn't appear to be conscious as he saw it. They didn't have language. Now, some of this is based on the historical and religious contextual factors of the time, but nevertheless, basically Descartes believed that human beings and animals were different. Animals are basically, as Descartes saw it, biological machines. They simply react to things in their environment in a reflexive way, but they don't have consciousness. Human beings, on the other hand, are distinct, and again, this is partly based on a kind of religious basis, but he believed that human beings were distinct because they had something separate. They had a soul or consciousness or mind. So Descartes basically believed that there is something that human beings have that is distinct from what animals have, and that is the mind. And Descartes believed that that was something that was separate and distinct from the physical body, therefore that it was immaterial, that it was separate from, it was not part of the human body, and therefore also that it wasn't therefore subject to the normal laws of science. So Descartes was very influential in that he identified the psyche or the soul, the features that make human beings, that give us will and intention and high level thinking and language and so on and so forth. But he argued that the mind element was immaterial and therefore couldn't be studied in a scientific fashion. Now, although Descartes talked about these two things being different, and this is normally referred to as dualism, specifically in Descartes' context, it's called Cartesian dualism, it's named after him, in which he argues that the mind and the body are distinct and separate. Descartes is also an interactionist, and by that, he was aware that the mind and the body interact. So, for example, if he wanted to move his arm, as I'm just doing now, like that, he was doing that by will, by intention. So he knew that the mind could interact with the body by causing the body to do things. But he also knew that that was a two-way interaction as well. So, for example, if he was feeling hungry, if he hadn't eaten for a while, his body would produce hunger pangs, and those hunger pangs would cause Descartes to go off and raid the fridge, for example. So basically Descartes knew that there was an interaction between the mind and the body. So basically he believed that they were separate and they were distinct, but nevertheless there was an interaction. Now, if the mind is immaterial but the body is physical, then that implies that somewhere there must be a root or sort of a linking point between the mind and the body. Now, Descartes was struggling to try and work out where that interaction took place, but he eventually thought that he identified it a point in the brain called the pineal gland. Now, the pineal gland is a tiny organ at the top of the brainstem, and Descartes thought because it was right in the middle of the brain that perhaps that was the linking point between the mind and the body. However, one of the big problems with Descartes' theory is that issue of the mind being immaterial. How can an immaterial mind interact with a physical body? To be honest, Descartes didn't really know, couldn't really explain that, and that is one of the big problems with his theory. He identifies an immaterial mind and a physical body, and even a connection point between the two, but doesn't indicate how it's possible for an immaterial mind to interact with a physical body. The other problem is with Descartes' theory in terms of psychology being a science, is that he basically argues that the human mind is not something that can be studied using the methods of science. Because the mind is not material, it's not subject to the normal physical laws of the universe, that means that ultimately, although you can identify the psych part of psychology, you can't study it scientifically. And therefore, this is a problem if you want psychology to be a science. Fortunately, there are different ways of thinking about the relationship between the mind and the body, and one of those is called materialism. Now, materialism is a different approach which suggests that instead of the mind and the body being separate, materialism proposes that the mind and body are in fact the same. The idea would be that the mind is actually simply a byproduct of physical processes in the brain. And one of the key advocates for this approach in the 17th century, around about the same time that Descartes was working, was an English philosopher by the name of Thomas Hobbes. Now, Thomas Hobbes specifically proposes that if you want to study the mind, you can do that because the mind is basically the byproduct of physical processes in the brain and the body. And therefore, materialism is a step forward based on dualism because it enables the scientific study of the mind by studying the brain and the body. Now, another leading figure around this time, also working in the area of philosophy, was a philosopher by the name of John Locke, another English philosopher. And John Locke was also influential because he proposed the idea that the mind is not, as Descartes suggested, unable to be studied or unable to be applied the rules of the physical universe. John Locke argued that the mind was part of the physical universe just as everything else is. So just as Hobbes had pointed out that it's possible that the mind is the byproduct of the body and therefore can be studied in a material way, John Locke also argued against Descartes' point that basically you couldn't study the mind because it wasn't subject to the physical laws of the universe. John Locke proposed that it was. Another key difference between John Locke and Descartes is how they went about collecting information and studying things. So Descartes focused on the idea that to study the world you couldn't rely on your sensory data, because he was quite right in identifying the fact that our sensory systems can fool us. We can be fooled by illusions, we can make mistakes, and so on and so forth. So Descartes argued that instead of using our senses to collect data, what we should do is we should reason, we should think, we should apply logic. We should think through things and things would come to light that way. The problem with that is that although Descartes was quite correct that we can be fooled by sensory data, we can also make mistakes in our mind. Our reasoning can be flawed, we can make erroneous judgments, our memories are quite fragile and can be quite easily distorted, and therefore reasoning and thinking and rationalisation that Descartes talked about wasn't necessarily the best way to discover truths about the world. Now, John Locke, by comparison, proposed that although there were issues with collecting data using sensory means, he proposed an idea called empiricism. Empiricism says that we can and should be striving to collect data from the real world using our senses. And yes, we can be fooled, but if we collect that data in a sensible way, in an appropriate way, in an objective way, then that means that other people can look at that same data. And if we make an error or if we're fooled, then other people will be able to look at that data and verify it or maybe question it. So John Locke argues that we can basically collect data from the outside world. We can use that to create hypotheses about the world. We can then collect more data to test those hypotheses. We can then build theories and so on and so on and so forth. So by continually collecting data, we are able to form the basis for hypotheses, to carry out experiments, build theories, and then revise those theories as we collect more data. So what we can see is that during the 17th century, René Descartes made psychology a thing by focusing on the mind, but unfortunately Descartes' approach is difficult to reconcile with science because it's difficult to study the mind using scientific principles if it's immaterial. By contrast, Thomas Hobbes suggested that in fact we can use a materialistic approach. We can study the mind because the mind is simply the byproduct of the brain, and therefore we can study the mind, we can have a psychology by studying the mind, by studying the brain and the body. In addition, John Locke argued that we can also sort of apply the laws of the physical universe to the mind, and also that we can use empiricism to collect data and form theories, which is a key basis for all of science, but also specifically psychology. Therefore, what I've shown in this lecture is how discussions amongst philosophers, what we might call experimental philosophers, dealt with debates about the mind and how the mind could be studied in a scientific way. In the next lecture, what I'm going to do is show how those kind of foundations then led to developments in the 19th century in science and particularly in physiology and in medicine, which led to Wilhelm Wundt creating psychology as a science in 1879.